have the future of public service through law, another very special session being moderated by Mr. Rishabh Gulati, Editor-in-Chief of NewsX, and with him will be Mr. Nalin Kohli, Advocate and National Spokesperson of the BJP. A huge round of applause for our next guest as well, Mr. Nalin Kohli. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us at the second Law and Constitution Dialogue. I request Mr. Rishabh Gulati to bring Mr. Nalin Kohli onto the stage to take this conversation on the future of public service through law forward at the second Law and Constitution Dialogue. I request all our audience members to kindly settle down for the next session. Request everyone to please settle down. Thank you so much. Over to you, Rishabh.
Thank you, Devika. We've had a couple of very riveting and articulate speeches, and I have the pleasure of sitting with an equally articulate individual whom, of course, we've known through television interactions, and none of you need an introduction. Nalinji, thank you so much for taking out the time to share your thoughts with us, not only to people here, but people watching on India News and NewsX. Sir, let me come to a larger pointed conversation. And I was discussing with a whole host of young lawyers today. There is a perception that has been made about the media, and I understand where it comes from. That a lot of the media is about frivolous things, it's about hyperbole, it's about tamasha. And for people who try to do something different, it can sometimes be difficult to understand, sometimes even a bit hurtful. When we look at law as a profession, and coming to the topic when we say judgments that shape the future of India, there are so many points of conversation that we forget when we say that lawyers, are doing cases, criminal cases, divorce cases, property cases, or that things that shape the country is Ayodhya and 370. Actually, the reason all of us wear seat belts in cars is because of judicial processes. The reason you have CNG buses is because of judicial processes. The reason women's safety measures are invoked in many public transportation systems is because of judicial processes. So there are many things which are involved in that. And there's a reason that lawyers get involved in public life as well. You've been one such, sir. I'm going to start with the most basic of questions, and it might be a bit biographical. Tell us a bit about your journey before we get into this, sir.
Thank you, Rishabh, and good evening to all your friends and guests who are here and also joining us live. You've raised a very pertinent question in terms of law shaping our lives. In fact, law dominates and in some way or the other matters in every facet of our life, because after all, we live in a society governed by rule of law. Coming to your question directly, my journey has been an interesting mix of several experiences that have come together and helped me also in my legal career. I started as a sort of journalist and anchor. I used to read the English news on Doordarshan. I did it for almost 10 years, from 93 to 2003. So communication, I would say, dominated the first 10 years of my life, which has continued since I've been on television since 1989. Then the second part was my exposure to public life in terms of politics, working in the government briefly in the rank of a joint secretary. Thereafter, working in the BJP as the co-convener of the media cell. So I set up the media cell, worked there, continued, and I've grown to become finally one of the spokespersons in the party. But my profession, and I make this distinction, is law. And I've been practicing in the Supreme Court for over a decade now. And in that period, I would say that all my three experiences have helped me. And if I may just share it, because there are several young future colleagues of ours in the audience. They are young students. They are people who will choose the career of law. As Justice Suryakant was saying, either on this side or that side of the bench. But what I have learned is, as an arguing counsel, because that's my main focus of work, is that it really brings three things together. One is obviously good communication skills, and it works when you're able to succinctly, very briefly, very effectively reduce a large amount of a file to a few points without losing the gist of it. So it's like taking out the essence of it. The second is thinking on your feet, because the judge can ask you anything. Anything and everything. So you need to be the master of your facts in terms of the file. And the third is equally important, each one of them is the knowledge of law in terms of judgments, in terms of the statute, its interpretation, precedents. So finally, I call it a three-legged stool, in which each leg matters for you to be a good lawyer.
Okay. I can sympathize, because sometimes we are told here's a 173-page judgment and you've got 70 minutes to figure it out for your next telecast. So it is understandable. But we are here to discuss the future and public service. Now, I know this is not a quintessential political conversation. We are on a different format. But I don't think this is a political question. The Prime Minister talks about something called the ease of living. And navigating rules and regulations and what is okay and what's not okay and who gets to decide that, not only in the system of jurisprudence, but in day-to-day life, involves understanding the language of law. So how is the future of public service or the ease of living going to change, sir, in the application of having people like you who understand both?
So there are multiple facets to what you're asking, Rishabh. The first is, I would say unhesitatingly, that my experience in public life has helped my law. My learning about life and my exposure to things has helped me in law. And vice versa. My practice in courts has helped me in public life. Because the legislative process, the executive process, all of it finally finds way in the court. And then the court interprets it. Or the court expands it or narrows something. Or even modifies it. Now, in terms of ease and language, because in law everything matters, every word, every comma, the context in which that word is written, what is the legislative intent, the objective before you pass a law, all of it matters. The language to a layman seems complicated. And in fairness, perhaps is complicated also. And when you have judicial pronouncements where you have may can be read as shall may be read down as may. So when in that context, it becomes even more difficult for someone who's not trained in law. So I often tell people that studying law is a good option, even if you don't decide to be a practicing lawyer. It demystifies law for you. It helps you read the statute in a particular way. And we are governed by statutes. We can't say that ignorance, because ignorance is no defense. So you can't turn around and say that I didn't know. I didn't know is not a defense. You are supposed to be compliant to the law. So basically, I think it's not really the language of the statute which needs to be looked at. What is needed is much more efforts like NewsX is doing, which is about legal education or demystifying law. I think that's the key. It's how do you reach out and let people know. And it's happening. And one of the reasons it's happening is that people are exercising their rights in the court even more because they, A, are become aware of their rights, and B, are confident that they wish to exercise their rights. So that is also leading to greater filings in the courts. And that's a healthy sign, because ultimately, you want people to be aware of their rights and to exercise it, and you expect that finally courts will adjudicate on those rights.
Okay, so as you know, you'll know better than me, and people watching at home will understand this as well. There's a whole body of the law that's written, and then there is a whole different voluminous amount of precedents that help you translate, understand it, and fine-tune it, and carry a lot of weight when it comes to judgments that are being decided upon. So having a lot of volume sometimes is a good thing. Having decades and decades of it is a good thing. But there's also so many volumes of laws. And I was I'll take up the theme of ease of living a bit further. I'll come to that were just sitting there, there's still statuettes regarding whether you can leave your horse in a particular location or not. So they were just sitting there. Why was a need felt that at least some manthan, some little bit of mind needs to be applied, that all the things that are sitting there that can be purged, that no longer require at least criminalization, for example, where a simple civil penalty will do. Why was that thought needed?
So let me first give you some data, since you're referring to the steps of the government and
Yeah.
Prime Minister Modi's government in terms of what it has done. So 1,486 laws have been repealed. That's not a small number. Now, if a law or a statute exists, you can be prosecuted under that statute, or you are obligated to follow it. Now, I'll come to examples shortly. 103 offenses have been decriminalized. Not everything means that you need to take the criminal route. 327 redundant provisions have been deleted. They were not needed. They were written in a certain time. You don't need it today. 1,200 processes have been simplified. That you don't need to follow all the steps. Make it simpler, make it more direct in today's world. And you finally have 22,000 compliances reduced. This was data that the Ministry of Commerce put out recently, and 13,000 of them have been further simplified. So I remember, and I'm going to quote anecdotally, that several years ago, somewhere around 2013, perhaps, before Prime Minister Modi was sworn in, there was a meeting of the party, and Prime Minister Modi gave a very interesting example of what he had done in Gujarat. And that was in terms of how do you repeal unnecessary acts or how do you modify it. So he said, एक lift inspector है, उसका signature चाहिए. Till he puts his signature, you can't, he comes, inspects, you can't use the lift. Now you have multi-story buildings. You have buildings where elderly live. Now the number of lift inspectors was limited, but the number of buildings with lifts waiting for clearance was very high. What would a lift inspector do? Come, press a button, go up, press a button, come down, and see that the lift is working. So he said, let's remove this requirement and take it on affidavit. That I am taking an affidavit and putting it on affidavit that yes, my lift is okay, it's following all compliances. My lift is installed as per the requirements. You can inspect any time. And in the meantime, my affidavit is for going ahead and working the lift. So that's what ease is about. Ease is not, see, we have to be compliant with the laws. But ease is not making it a burden on you. That you need to do this, which is unnecessary. Because any compliance then calls for time, effort, and sometimes money. So the government's focus has been on ease of doing business for two reasons. Simplifying life for Indian citizens and making it more attractive for foreign investments. Let's take it at a mass scale. Same of ease. Land records. Now land is precious. People's rights on land. Sometimes you have wars, fights, physical fights, bloody fights. Or fights in case in law for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years involving rights of land.
Yeah.
Papers are not available.
Yeah.
So you digitize it. You digitize it and people can get their details at a click of a mouse. These are the steps that in the last 10 years have been a focus. And I think they are making India more transparent. They are linking up with the digital economy, taking the requirements right down to the last person. Like money being delivered at home through the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, direct benefit transfer going to several million people every month or a few months into their accounts.
Yeah, so on procedural things, I remember going to university and every single photocopy of document had to be notarized by a gazetted officer. Now,
Not required anymore.
Yes, so if you're in Delhi, you probably have access to a gazetted officer. If you're outside the national capital or outside a major city, finding a gazetted officer to notarize every photocopy, one looking back, it was a major stress load on just getting your file together to get your admission done, regardless of how much access you had. So on this thought, because we're talking about law in public life, is all these things, it's not just the law, we understand that it is passed in parliament, it's so many procedures and rules that are set. Do you think this sets the tone from government across other branches and arms and states and even in organizations, that the simplification, the ease for the person to not only understand what their rights are, what their duties are, what their privileges are, what they need to furnish. For example, today, if you do a credit card application, you're doing an e-KYC in 30 seconds on your phone with a selfie, and you're done.
Or DigiLocker.
Yeah, it's
DigiLocker to carry all your documents.
So, in public life, in designing these architectures, how much scope is there further? That look, we need to keep on parsing through and design these architectures where the object is service delivery for the people, not to make it as complicated as possible so that the officer in charge has most amounts of points of harassment.
So that's I think, a very, very interesting question you're asking, Rishabh, because it really takes you back. If you have to look at it, it takes you back to what India was and where India is and where India is going. So India started as a young republic, as a country of shortages, of scarcities. So you had what was famously known, and several of your viewers may not be aware of it, which is the period of the 60s and the 70s, the license Raj. So the license Raj was about giving quotas, that you can manufacture 20,000 cars a year. No more. We will give you a license to manufacture 20,000 cars. Now, if you took a license for 20,000 cars and the demand is for 40,000, what are you going to do? You're going to wait in a queue. And that license becomes precious. It has its own other implications of people wanting to see, kisi tarah bada do bhai, 21,000 kar do, 22,000 kar do. Control. So this license Raj was the first dismantling that took place in the decade of the 90s, which is the period called of liberalization. The second phase, if I look at it, was about consolidating on liberalization, which was from the late 90s to the mid-2000s. What we find in the last one decade is about the pace, the scale and the speed of making things accessible to the lowest common denominator, which means taking everything down, which is delivery of services, transparency, fighting corruption in a larger way. All of it this is the focus of that, to take India into the next leap, which is to become a global economy or a global economic player. In the last 10 years, India, because of these steps, has grown its economy to the level that in 10 years we have moved from number 10 to number 5. We are inching towards number 4 in a very short period. The target is to be among the top 2 or 3 economies in the world, which is a target for the next 20 years. At least we now today have a vision that we need to be there and we will move there, for which you need to make processes transparent, more effective, less burdensome.
So for which you have to unleash Team India. So in many respects, you have to get out of the way. So, just to take that thought process forward in the theme of the conversation, I, for decades, of course, been hosting television conversations, and generally when it comes to criminal matters, you have a bunch of people saying this needs to be stronger, this needs to be harsher, there needs to be far worse punishment, so as a much greater deterrent for lots of things. Some of them are very serious, some of them can be petulant. But for the first time, I had hosted a conversation when this decriminalization of several of the laws happened very recently, about what actually doesn't need to be so harsh. What is actually already too harsh? What can just be a financial penalty or a fine, and not 3 months in prison. So the person who's trained like you, going through or having a mindset now as a collective that we are going to go through a whole host of these things and actually parse through them and see, okay, what is not needed, what is just way too harsh, what is offensive, and what is a stick to beat the common person with. Do you see this now becoming a sort of a momentum across the board, that all sorts of organizations start examining these things?
So, Rishabh, that I would feel, in my personal opinion, is something that can happen for what you may consider routine or standard compliances. But when you cross a certain threshold where criminality begins, to compound it becomes a little more complicated. So, as anyone who studies law or is studying law knows, that a criminal act is an act against society. That is why the state is always the prosecutor. It's state versus X, state versus Y. And it's really the prosecution is by the state. So in that aspect, compounding something or letting it go with a monetary fine is possible where it's not heinous in nature or not serious in nature. So when it becomes serious, compounding becomes a problem. And that's why that threshold is kept in the number of years that are there. So when you asked your question also, you correctly pointed out for something for 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, there's no problem. In such things, it's easier to do. But if something in the statutes is, say, 7 years or 10 years or life, to compound it is very difficult.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left, so I have to ask you. So how do you see, sir, having gone through this and you've elucidated at the beginning of this conversation, when you see a next bunch, and there are a bunch in all political parties, a lot of lawyers. India has a great tradition, historical tradition of lawyers being involved in public life. When you see them getting in, where do you see this going 10, 20, 30 years from now? What is the future of the lawyer politician?
So globally, lawyers and politics are quite common. So you have several people...
That and film stars.
Yes, so there are several people who have made it to top positions who are basically lawyers. I mean, President Obama, if I may just point out, in the UK, US, in other economies and democracies, it's common. In India, actually, it's come down. If I recall, someone was speaking about it maybe a couple of years ago, that when we started as a nation, a young nation, we had a large number of lawyers who were in the house, in parliament, upper and lower house, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha. Take Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, take Mr. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the stalwart who wrote or led that process for the Constitution. And there were so many in the Constituent Assembly as lawyers who came into public life. Jawaharlal Nehru himself was a lawyer. Motilal Nehru himself was a lawyer. Now, Jawaharlal Nehru ji may not have practiced after a certain point, but Motilal ji did practice.
Mahatma Gandhi,
so therefore, Mahatma Gandhi himself. So therefore, that presence of people from the legal fraternity in public life was high. Today, it's low. And there are two reasons for it. A lot more people from different professions have actually stepped out and got into public life. So that's one reason. The second is that perhaps lawyers have become too busy in the courts and therefore don't see the need to fight elections more easily. Because elections is, after all, serving the people full time. In the 50s, somebody could perhaps, continue with the profession and go to the constituency once a month, maybe twice in 6 months, if the constituency was far. Today, it's a full-time job. You have to be with your constituents. They are digitally connected to you. You need to be with them every day.
So let me reverse that. But has politics also become that full-time thing? I mean, if you are today a young spokesperson and you are expected to give hours per day,
it's time
it's become full-on 24/7.
Yes, it is time-consuming. It's serious because people's expectations are higher.
Have become higher.
And therefore, but I want to finally come on to the question of the lawyers on a positive note.
Sure, please.
Since the numbers come much lower than what it was, I genuinely believe that this number of lawyers will increase going ahead, because when you're transitioning to a developed economy, the need for those who are better at the legislative process, those who understand the nuances of the legislative process, that would be a skill set of value. So it may go up a little bit.
No, I think it remains forever a skill set of immense value. I have not even discussed the point that for time immemorial it has been taken as a premise that to argue before a person sitting in judgment before you, a judge, requires the power of great oratory, which is something important when you're sitting before the biggest judge, which is the wisdom of the crowd that votes for you. Nalin Kohli, what a treat it was to have you on this conversation as we have discussed a subject that is so crucial, because you look around you, I mean, several people you've seen, all of them are involved in public life. You heard them through the day. You heard Dr. Singhvi, Justice Suryakant. Every decision that you now make, you have an immediate bearing on the fabric of the country, which will be cited for many decades later, and that thought must bear upon you as you're writing it. Nalin Kohli, what a treat.
Thank you
very
so much,
sir.
Rishabh. On a positive note for the youngsters, thank you, is that law as a profession is expanding. There's great scope in it, and I, on a light note, say, भाई हर आदमी को जिंदगी में एक डॉक्टर और वकील की जरूरत पड़ ही जाती है. So I wish all of you, the younger members in the audience well, your viewers, and thank you, Rishabh, for having me.
I might not too late for me to do my LLB. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kohli, for giving us your time, sir, your very valuable time to be with us at the second Law and Constitution Dialogue.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.